Welcome to the Heritage Resources Distinguished Speakers Program, featuring our very own Brian Griffin, the renowned Brian Griffin, who is going to speak about adventures in historical research. Before I introduce Brian, I do want to make some brief thank yous. First of all, I'd like to thank our colleagues Jeanette Gomes and Allison Costanza here in the Archives building for their support of this event and for fostering an ongoing partnership between the Western Libraries and the Washington State Archives that makes state history available to the public. I'd also like to thank the wonderful staff in Heritage Resources here in the libraries for their leadership with the Heritage Resources Distinguished Speakers Program. Today's event is a tribute to their commitment and skill in building bridges to the community. And with no further ado, to introduce our today's distinguished speaker, Brian L. Griffin enjoys deep roots in Bellingham. He was born here, and with the exception of 4 years at Whitman College and 2 years with the U.S. Army in Korea, he's lived in the South Hill neighborhood all of his life. He enjoys many activities, interests, and achievements. He's the author of 6 books, 2 of them about native bees and 4 about local history. He has been an insurance broker, a retailer, and an expert on the orchard mason bee. He is the founder of Knox Sellers Native Bee Pollinators, a business that popularized this important and now widely used pollinator, and he creates custom ukuleles, which he sells all over the world. Brian's been very active in community affairs. He led efforts to build the downtown parkade, the downtown shopping mall, and numerous other improvements to that area of the city. He played an important role in the creation of Boulevard Park, was chair and leader of the Fairhaven Village Green Committee, and more recently led efforts to build Depot Market Square, home to the Bellingham Farmers Market. An English major turned historian, in 2009, yes, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. An English major turned historian in 2009. Brian co-authored My Darling Anna about the life, love, and legacy of the late 20th century Fairhaven physician W.R. Gray. He published Boulevard Park and Taylor Avenue Dock on the old Bellingham waterfront in January 2014. That same year, he curated the Whatcom Museum exhibit, Treasures from the Trunk, the J.J. Donovan story, and he wrote the accompanying exhibit catalog. This past December, he published his latest local history book entitled Fairhaven, A History, and those books are for sale with us today. Brian's honors are many and include the Sally Rogers Award for Lifetime Achievement by Whitman College, the Whatcom County Lifetime Business Achievement Award by Northwest Business Magazine, Monthly Magazine, the Chamber of Commerce Man of the Year Lifetime Achievement Award, the Rotary Club of Bellingham Community Service Award, the Whatcom Parks Foundation William Dietrich Award, and in 2015, the Bellingham Mayor's Living Treasure Award. Well, if you've taken one of Brian's history cruises on Bellingham and Chuckanut Bays, or heard him speak before, you know that the mayor was right. I'm honored to say that Heritage Resources in the Western Libraries has a particularly strong relationship with Brian. He's a frequent researcher here and has enjoyed numerous adventures among our collections. We hold copies of his books. The Center for Pacific Northwest Studies is home to the Brian L. Griffin papers. Brian made possible the placement of the J.J. Donovan papers here at the center, where he is working on a book about Mr. Donovan. Today, we're very excited for Brian Griffin to share adventures in historical research.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that rather lengthy introduction. I'm here today to share with you and hopefully impress you with the excitement of what to some might seem a rather mundane activity, researching history. I can assure you that it is perhaps as exciting, well, Mike Impero might know, it's as exciting as prospecting for gold, because indeed you find little veins of gold, and once in a while you hit the bonanza, you find the mother lode. At any rate, researching history is not a singular, not a lonely thing to do. It takes numbers of people, not the least of which are the people that work in this place, this marvelous archive of historical information. It also takes fellow history nuts who like to work with you, and I'm going to make an introduction right now. I want to introduce you to Gail Helgo, the lady sitting in the front row over here, who has shared so many historical adventures with me and has edited my books and been a constant resource. Gail is a librarian, an editor, a historian, and a good friend. And sitting next to her is David Lawrence, who is a wonderful videographer. And Dave and I first met on an adventure that I'll be telling you about. He was hired by the Watkin Museum to do a little job for us, and we met, and he's been videographing, if that's a word, my adventures ever since. So we're going to talk about those a little bit too. David runs a business, home video, family history of videos. Excuse me, Dave. So if you want your family history done, talk to Dave. Well, at any rate, we're also going to have a little Q&A period. Time is fleeting on us. We're going to have a little Q&A period after I've finished my presentation, but I'm going to jump the gun and answer a question that's always asked me: how did you get interested in history? And I think that I have to credit that to my maternal grandfather, Arthur Clemens Miller. He was born in Peoria, Illinois in 1855, and he died in 1955, the year after I graduated from college. He lived for 100 amazing years, and I grew up with him. He told me stories for those early years of my life, and I'm going to share a few of those stories with you. He grew up in Peoria, Illinois, when the Civil War was still going. And as a boy, when he was 7 or 8, his job was to take the family cow from the stable and take it before school to the public pasture, and then after school pick the cow up again and bring it back to the stable. Well, one day he went to pick up the cow, and his cow and all the other cows in the pasture had their tails cut off. And down at the end of the pasture were the tents of the Union troops that were camped there, that just had moved in, and they were making oxtail soup. So you're talking to a man who talked to a man who saw something of the Civil War. It's kind of amazing in itself. In 1877, he left Peoria and he homesteaded on the Cherokee Strip in Kansas. And his Cherokee Strip story was, one day a cavalry officer rode up on a horse and said, we're escorting a group of Indians to the Oklahoma Indian Territory, and we need to camp for the night. Can we use your property? My grandfather said, sure. And he met Chief Joseph. He was invited to dinner with Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, who had just been defeated, and they were taking those poor people to the Indian Territory. He came to San Francisco. Well, he left Kansas. He decided farming wasn't his thing, and he went somewhere and learned to make cigars. And he then went west to San Francisco. The fleas drove him out of San Francisco, so he got on a boat with his brother Pete, and they came to Seattle, and where he became the first cigar maker in the territory of Washington in 1885. And there he is. This was at his retirement day. The PI wrote about him in 1941 when he retired as a cigar maker. And good Lord, I read that article again the other day, and it says, I'll be 85 in November. And I thought, my God, I'm almost that old. I'm going to be 84 in November. Oh well, time does march on. At any rate, he was an amazing man who had, he loved to hunt and he loved to fish, and one of the stories that I recall, he didn't tell me this, I witnessed this. My family went on a hunting trip in eastern Washington to the Hanford area, where the atomic plant now is. And we were driving down the road. My father was driving. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And a rattlesnake came across this dusty old road. And my father stopped the car as the rattlesnake went across the road. My grandfather got out of the car and he walked right up to that snake and picked it up by the tail and snapped its neck, broke its neck, just like a whip. And he promptly reached in his pocket and pulled out his jackknife and cut the rattles off. And he gave them to me. And here they are. So how could you not be impressed by a man like that? Well, another one of his great stories. He had a cigar shop on 2nd Avenue, just off 1st Avenue, off the corner of Pioneer Square, where the Butler Hotel was later built, a little frame building. In 1889, the fire started, the Great Seattle Fire, and he knew that his factory was going to be burned, so he went to a wagon stable and he rented a wagon and he hired a man, and he brought his shotgun. He had just received a shipment of tobacco on a sailing ship, and it was stored in the warehouse on the waterfront. So they loaded the wagon up with tobacco, and he also stopped at a hardware store and bought a tent. And they went to Prefontaine Square, the open ground which is in front of the present County City building. Now it's Prefontaine Park. He set up a tent. He put his tobacco in it. One guy, he hired a man with a bucket to throw water on the canvas tent so it wouldn't catch fire, and the other guy stood there with a shotgun protecting it, and he survived the Seattle fire. He made cigars in that. His original factory burned, but he made cigars for a year in that tent in Prefontaine Square. Kind of cool. He also gave me a gift one time that I treasure. He knew Princess Angeline, Chief Seattle's daughter. She was an old Duwamish woman, lived down by the Duwamish River, and sold trinkets to totem poles and things and baskets to the white folks. And he gave me this little cedar canoe. And he told me that I traded this with Princess Angeline for tobacco. Well, he was, I told you, the first cigar maker in the territory of Washington. And this is one of his cigar boxes. This was his first class, his fancy cigar, named after his son, my uncle, Uncle Clemens, Master Clemens. And so that kind of gets us to, well, you know, I always regretted that I learned a lot from my grandfather, but I really never, I'd love to be able to talk to him today and do an oral history and really get the details. But that's about all I've got. Well, there's more, but I won't tell you now. At any rate, one day I was here in the archive working on something, and I for some reason I was looking at the old directories over there, and I thought, I wonder if I found one. This was 1890. So I thought, maybe my grandfather's in there, and I opened the directory, and there, at the very top of the page, Arthur C. Miller, Arthur Clemens Miller, cigar manufacturer, 1004 Front Street, rooms, Frank Clinch. Well, who in the world would Frank Clinch be? So obviously the next step was to turn the page to the C's. And there's Frank Clinch. And Frank, right there, Frank was the proprietor of the Jewel Saloon, and his residence was at 7 Mill Street. Well, I didn't know where Mill Street was, but that was a pretty good clue. By the way, I got to go back and tell you that there's Edward Miller. That's Uncle Pete, his brother. Pete was not the coolest. I think Pete might not have been entirely with it, because my grandfather took care of him all of his life, and he made cigars for my grandfather. But he rooms with Frank Clinch too. Well, that got me curious, and I decided to do my own oral history. By the way, I guess I should mention that I've done, because of my grandfather's stories, and because his son, my uncle, was also a great storyteller. While my uncle was still living, I borrowed a video camera, and I did an oral history of my uncle, and I was so pleased that I did it. He told me some grand tales, and it was a treasure. And I began to think I should do more of that. So I started doing oral histories of people of significance in Bellingham. For instance, I did Pat Fleeson, the woman who saved the Watkin Museum building from being destroyed after the fire. And I've done, I think, 32 or 3 oral histories of people like that. So I thought, well, maybe I'll do one myself. So I hired David, and we went to Seattle one day. We went to Seattle one day, and we were going to wander Pioneer Square because my grandmother, a German immigrant, her father was a minor founder of the Merchants Cafe. The Merchants Cafe is right there on the south side of Pioneer Square. It's the oldest restaurant on the West Coast still operating. And David and I went into the Merchants Cafe, and he had me leaning up against the bar telling stories. And a woman, I was telling a story about my uncle, who used to say, geez, here I was with this. I had to deliver cigars for my dad, and I'd bring a big bundle of these boxes of cigars with me in that little Lord Fauntleroy suit. And the bartender would always say, here comes Master Clemens, ha, ha, ha. So he was always embarrassed at that. At any rate, we were standing there, and I was telling my stories, and a woman walks up, all excited. She says, oh my gosh. And she introduced herself, and her name, if Dave, you remember, was Janet Christensen O'Brien. And she was a private detective. She had her office just across the street. And she says, I'm also a videographer, and I want to go with you as you look for your grandfather's, where he lived, and learn about this. And I've lived here for all my life, and I know all about it. Well, we didn't know where Mill Street was. It sounded like we better talk to this lady. So we said, sure, come along with us. She was a kick. She was with us for 3 hours, and we walked all over Pioneer Square. Well, we learned from her that Yesler Way, which is the street that the Merchants Cafe now fronts on, used to be called Mill Street. Yesler Way is Skid Road, the original Skid Road, and it's a high, steep street that goes up the hill, and it comes down, and one block below First Avenue, it hit the water where Yesler's sawmill was. That's why it was called Mill Street. Revelation. And anyway, we wandered all over. We went to see where my grandfather's original shop was, and I told them about my grandmother, the German immigrant who lived with her parents and her 4 sisters on the 2nd floor of the Merchants Cafe, and who worked as a waitress in the basement of in the restaurant of the Merchants Cafe. And so we went walking, and we couldn't figure out there were no street numbers, but Janet told us how to figure it out. The numbers of the streets started at the waterfront. and we walked up the street. We were looking for Frank Clinch's saloon. For the first time in my life, I realized how my grandparents met. He lived there, a half a block downhill from First Avenue. She lived and worked at the cafe a half a block the other direction, and his new factory was on 3rd Street, and he was a single man, and he wasn't cooking. He had to eat. He was waited on by my grandmother, and he fell in love with that cute gal with a German accent. Well, anyway.
I'll never forget that moment.
We had a lot of fun, didn't we? It was really quite a kick. Well, I've lived in Bellingham all my life, as you've learned, and I feel the roots. And I really, and that's why I guess I began doing oral histories. I had a good friend, Bob Moles. Some of you may have known him, the undertaker, who was a grand man and a fellow Rotarian. And he was really the man that made Boulevard Park happen. The Bellingham Rotary Club kind of got that started, and he was in charge. Bob was dying of cancer, and I wanted to go out and say goodbye. He lived out towards Ferndale. So I went out to visit with him, and he asked me if I would tell the story of Boulevard Park and how the Rotary Club made that happen. And of course, I said yes, I'd be happy to write the story. And then I thought, boy, I better do an oral history of Bob. So I came running back and bought a camera, and that really got me started doing oral histories. At any rate, so I wrote the Boulevard Park book, and the story of Boulevard Park kind of grew into a lot more than that. And that's when I discovered the archival treasures that we have in this community. This place is absolutely a treasure trove of information. You can't see it from here, but in the basement and over there are rack after rack after rack of the records of 7 Northwest counties. The Center for Pacific Northwest Studies has incredible collections of families and industries and businesses, and you can just find out about anything that you want here. And the delightful thing is that you get help. There are wonderful people here who guide you through and through the information. So if you want to research anything, here's a place to come. We also have the Watkin Museum and Jeff Jewell and his 300,000 images in their photo archive. The Bellingham Public Library has an excellent section. The Chicago Title Company has got the old records, and Gordy Twait's basement museum, which I understand is not going to be with us very much longer. But this is a great place to research history, and it's really exciting to do it. So I want to share a few stories about my excitement in that. One day, I got a phone call from the director of the Bridget Collins House. And he said, you do oral histories, would you do a documentary on the life of Bridget Collins? None of us who work here ever met her. We don't know anything about her other than that she was a Catholic nun and worked at St. Joe's. And I knew Bridget, she was a delightful person. So I agreed to do that. And I called my friend Neely Nelson, and who is in Hawaii, but she ought to be sitting in the front row with my friends here, with my history nut friends. This was Bridget Collins. And Neely quickly found the ship that she immigrated on in 1924 on the internet. And then she quickly found the manifest, and so here's Bridget. And the 8 gals below her here are all young Irish women who were coming to America to become nuns. And I looked at this name. There used to be a Sister Ellen at the hospital. I remembered a Sister Ellen. So I contacted a friend of mine, a Catholic nurse who had worked at the hospital for years, and she said, Yeah, Ellen Caldwell was her name. That's Ellen Caldwell. She's still living, and she's down at St. Mary's on the Lake, the retirement home for nuns in Bellevue. Well, I got on in my car and headed for Bellevue. By the way, here is Bridget, and here's Ellen. Some of you may remember that they were quite a bit younger when that picture was taken. At any rate, the convent is in a lovely spot on Lake Washington in Bellevue, and as I parked my car and walked through the grounds to the building, I saw this statue. And it's just lovely in that setting with the green trees, and I thought, you know, that I've seen that somewhere before. That really rings a bell with me. But I passed on, and I went and did my oral history with Sister Ellen and looked at the statue again when I passed it by going back to the car, and I got home, and it just kind of haunted me. Maybe that's what happens to historians, you get curious. And I rattled around in some old pictures. Maybe I came here, I don't really recall. And sure enough, hit the wrong button. Sure enough, this is the old statue that used to stand at the State Street entrance of St. Joseph's Hospital when St. Joe's was on State Street. And I remembered that, I guess, because I used to help Pete Uncles, who had the paper route, and the Herald would leave the papers right here in a big pile, and Pete and I would go there and fold the papers and put them in our bag and then walk up through the hospital and try and sell a few papers in the men's ward and then go on to the route. Well, at any rate, I did the documentary of Bridget Collins and got it put together in a nice CD, and I took it down. A couple months later, I went back to St. Mary's to show it to the nuns and to give them a copy. And this time I really looked that statue over carefully, and to my astonishment, I cleared away the leaves, and there it said, "Gift of J.J. Donovan." Well, one thing leads to another, friends. J.J. Donovan was always kind of my history hero. I knew quite a bit about him. And I used to insure, when I was in the insurance business, a lot of old mill workers, and they'd talk to me about him and what an honorable man he was and how much they loved JJ. So I thought, by God, that statue, that beautiful statue, needs to come back to Bellingham. And it needs to be back at the hospital where JJ gave it in honor of two little grandsons who died early. One was 3 and one was just 1. And here's that beautiful statue, Donovan statue in Bellevue, for God's sake. So I determined to get it back. But how do you do that? Well, first you got to convince the sisters in Bellevue to give it up. So I thought, and then you got to have a reason to bring it back other than just return it. So I thought, gee, maybe I could convince the Watkin Museum to do an exhibit, a history exhibit on J.J. Donovan. And I went to Patty Leach and I made a pitch and wrote her a little resume, and I'll be darned, before long I found myself a museum curator. And then we decided we needed to, I wanted to talk to any family members to get them to write letters to the sisters in Seattle saying, give us back our statue, our grandparent statue. Once again, I went to Neely Nelson, who is a wonder researcher on the internet, and she soon found me two living grandchildren, the last 2 living grandchildren. One of them in Michigan, and one of them in New York. And I called them both, and the one in New York, Patricia Donovan Plim, was 90 years old. She died 2 weeks after I talked to her, but not before she wrote a letter to the nuns saying, please give my grandfather's statue back. And the other one, a gentleman who lived in New York, And he said, yes, I'd be happy to help. I'll write a letter. Donovan Craven is his name. He was 89. He's 92 now. He had some things that he would loan us for the exhibit, and from him I got lots of names of family members to ask for things that they could loan us. So it just so happened that my wife and I were headed into Washington, D.C. To a Smithsonian event, and I'd made a date with Donovan Craven to meet him in New York and to pick up some of these things that he would loan me for the exhibit. And I called him at the airport. After all, he was 89. I thought I'd better call him before I left to remind him that we had a meeting in 3 days. And so I called, and he said, you know, I'm glad you called. Just last night, my wife called my niece, who lives in New Mexico, excuse me, and she says she has some things for you. So he gave me that number. I called the niece, a lovely gal, Kathy Riggs. She says, yes, I have some stuff, and I'd be delighted to loan you these things for the exhibit, but my father really has them, and he lives in Sag Harbor on Long Island, New York. And that was getting kind of close to where I was going. She gave me his phone number, and when I got to D.C., the plane was leaving, I had to get on the plane. When I got to D.C., I called him quickly. We talked for an hour. Albert Riggs was born in Bellingham. He lived in Bellingham most of his life. He was raised on Sycamore Street. He was a good friend of Jack Donovan, J.J.'s son. He revered the Donovan family, and in effect, he married a Donovan granddaughter and eventually divorced her after 25 or 8 years, something like that. At any rate, he says, I've got boxes and boxes and boxes. I've got an old trunk that full of Donovan papers, and I don't know what to do with it. And I'm 89 years old, and I'm delighted to hear from you representing the Watke Museum, and I'm willing to give you some of this stuff. So we made an arrangement to meet in Bridgeport, Connecticut a few days hence, and sure enough, he showed up. Here he is, Al Riggs. He came across the ferry on Long Island Sound to Bridgeport, and he had in the back of his truck two cardboard boxes with Donovan stuff. And well, later he told me, I knew I had the right man when you opened the box, when I saw the tears in your eyes. The box was full of letters, like you'll see over here, and diaries and photographs, and I was just blown away. It looked like a true treasure. But he says, oh, I've got more and more and more. I was just kind of testing you out. So he agreed to send all this stuff to me. He eventually sent 7 boxes of FedEx boxes, about that wide and about that deep, big boxes of just amazing stuff. I think Gail and I, we got it all in my house, and I called Gail and asked for help, and Gail and I took months and months to read over 2,020 personal letters, all in original envelopes, maybe 1,000 business letters on letterheads from every old business that you ever heard of in this town. Hundreds and hundreds of photographs, untold numbers of negatives. Just an amazing thing. Well, I'm happy to tell you that, and we used much of that for the show. Amongst that, some of the things in that box included this picture of J.J. at 21. We later learned in reading a letter when that was taken and why it was taken. And so here I was with that and diaries and things too precious to trust to the mails or to FedEx. I wanted to carry them home myself. So I brought onto the airplane several of the diaries and a couple of the great pictures, and I sat in the airplane and I was reading the diary, and I turned to this page. September 8th, 1883. I had heard the legend of J.J. Donovan riding out of the mountains of Montana to attend the last spike ceremony when the Northern Pacific was finally completed, and it was attended by General Grant and by Crow Indians and emissaries from foreign nations. It was a big deal. And here is J.J.'s description of that very event. So I was so excited when I got home I could hardly stand it, and I wrote an email to I'm sure Gail and to Neely and to a number of my history friends and to Jeff Jewell, saying, my God, we've just got a treasure trove here. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could find a photograph of that last spike ceremony? And 3 hours later, this appeared on my computer. Neely Nelson found that in the archives of the University of Montana. Well, it's a marvelous picture of Crow Indians standing on a railroad bed. The rails aren't laid, but you can see the ties. And I don't know what this confrontation is, but I was thrilled with the photograph, and Montana had it labeled Last Spike Ceremony. And then I started looking at the faces, blowing them up on my computer, and I got over here. I almost had a heart attack. That is J.J. Donovan. And if you don't believe it, just incredible. What in the world would have been the odds to be able to find that? I wish J.J. were living so he could have seen it. At any rate, so we put together the exhibition. The exhibition was a success. Here, by the way, are some of the letters. Look at the handwriting. Here's the exhibition, and we got the statue back to feature in the exhibition. And the good news is that the story ended well, because now it stands beside the entrance of St. Joseph's Hospital, where J.J. would have wanted it. And under it are the words that J.J. put on a plaque honoring his grandchildren, John Nichols and Philip Hart, two grandsons who died very early. So I was standing there beside the statue, feeling very good about it, talking with one of the executives of St. Joe's, and he points down at this thing and he says, "What in the world's that?" He had no idea. Nobody at the hospital knew what that was. I knew immediately, because I'd read J.J.'s letters where he attended the cornerstone laying of the second hospital when they built it at State Street, June 22nd, 1900. So, amazing, fun. Well, one day David and I were wandering 12th Street in the South Hill. I was doing a documentary on the Croatians of South Bellingham. And we were with Pete Elich, Dr. Pete Elich, who was not too long ago, the retired dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He's a Croatian. He grew up on the south side, and Pete and I are old high school friends. We were walking the streets, and Dave was taking our picture as Pete pointed out buildings and told about the people who lived there and the boats they owned and all that sort of thing. And he looked down 12th Street and he pointed at this old building and he said, "You know, my father told me that he'd been told that once upon a time that was a hospital." Well, I've learned over the years that you don't ignore oral history. You can pick up precious clues. So I, of course, told Gail Helgo about it. And Gail happened to know the owner of the building. And the owner said, "You know, that's really strange. I'd never heard that, but we were digging a ditch under the building, under the crawl space, to put in that gas meter, or the gas furnace. And as we dug, we found amputated human parts, fingers and hands, Well, then we thought, wow, maybe that was a hospital. So then I talked to my old friend, Dr. John Arnold, many of you will remember, who went to Yale Medical School. And I told him the story. He said, yeah, you know, in the old medical school building in Yale, there was a dirt floor in the basement, and it was a consecrated burial place for parts and pieces. That's what you did. You don't just throw human parts in the dump, I guess. You bury them. Well, so now we were thinking, boy, maybe that oral history was right. And then one day, Gail Hilgo was over here looking for something. He's looking in those books over there in the old Polk directories for, I think, the Fairhaven World Publishing Company. Gail, is that it? And look what she found. Fairhaven Hospital, 1109 Douglas. Geez, that's the address of that old house. It's still there. It had been a hospital. Well, subsequent investigation has told us that in 1890, that, by the way, used to be an old wagon repair building. It wasn't a residence in the beginning. In the 1890, for a brief period, for 9 or 10 months, a local doctor had a little infirmary there, and when the Catholic nuns came to start St. Joseph's Hospital, they did a little training there, and they, in fact, lived in the back of the building. So that's the first hospital in Bellingham, on Bellingham Bay. It wasn't St. Joseph. St. Joseph was built on 17th Street and occupied in January of '91, while the nurses were training in that first building. So you can, at any rate, stories go on. Another fun story, one day I was up here reading, I was looking for something else, and I read in an 1896 newspaper on file here that Fairhaven had announced an Arbor Day, and that they had planted 113, I think it was, 117 cork bark elm trees along Front Street. Well, I knew that Front Street is now State Street. And I thought, wait a minute, elm trees, those are elm trees along State Street. So I immediately hopped in my car and that they were planted 25 feet apart. So I ran down to State Street with my tape measure, and I'll be damned. Those trees are 25 feet apart, and the city arborist assures me that they're elm trees, and those trees were planted in 1896, and there are still about 36 of them left. That's kind of fun. You know, it isn't very important to know that, but I can tell you it's exciting. And then if you read that article that I showed you a little more carefully, it says Arbor Day itself was celebrated at the 14th Street School, where the students planted trees on 14th Street. Well, this is where Lowell School is now. This building was built in 1890, and in 1912, I guess it was, Lowell School was built behind it, and this was torn down. But we can date this photograph for the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, because here are the new little trees that they just planted in 1896 on Arbor Day, supported by their supporting stakes. Now, we can't say that it was done. Maybe those trees are 1 or 2 or 3 years old, but you were darn close to knowing when that photograph was taken. Well, I had a wonderful experience meeting the grandson of C.X. Larrabee, and we had a long correspondence, and he helped me with a number of things. He told me about his generous grandmother who had given the YWCA its building and who cared for people. And he told me that during the Depression, she let the Knights of the Road, the hobos on the railroad during the Depression, camp on the beach at what he called Second Trestle. And she even put a water pipe in from a spring up higher in the land so those poor guys would have a little water. Well, one day I was in preparation for writing the Fairhaven book. I went through all the photographs that the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies has in the Galen Byrie collection, and I found this photograph, and it was labeled Highland Drive. Well, I live on Highland Drive, and I thought, and I've lived up in that neck of the woods all my life, and I thought, boy, that strange-looking piece of flat land, I wonder where that was. So I printed this on my out of my computer, and I went out one Sunday morning to find the location. And I called Gail, who lives down the street a block, and I said, Gail, we can find out where this was because we can triangulate these three, Orcas Island and Lummi Island and Point Francis. And once we get that picture exactly right, we'll be just where the photograph was taken. Well, we wandered all over the South Hill and up and down, and we were pooped, and Gail said, oh, we're nowhere near, and we argued about whether we should go farther down or farther up. And anyway, we finally gave up, and I went back. I said, I got to get in my car. So I got in my car, and I started driving. I found that much easier. And I wandered all over and thinking, I'll never find this, but I eventually found it by going far south to Edgemore. And here was Mrs. Larrabee's land today with nice houses. This is Bayside Drive, Bayside Road, and there's the bridge. This is just directly behind First Trestle, the beach, and the hobos were living on the beach, and they were also living above. So this is Hooverville in Edgemore. Pretty cool. That was, those aren't very important things to find out, but they're sure fun. Well, I told you that I met by letter C.X. Larrabee, a charming, charming man, the grandson of the original C.X. Larrabee, and we shared all kinds of great information, and he introduced me to a man named Joe Hansen, and from 2008 until about a year ago when CX died, we had this marvelous conversation. Correspondence. This is half of the correspondence that the three of us wrote to each other. And I'd ask them history questions, and they'd give me answers, and it was just a marvelous thing. We didn't use email, we wrote letters. And at one point, Joe Hansen he's an engineer, so he drew this for me. And it's really fun because these are his memories. He drew this from memory, and it shows all kinds of, this is the railroad track, and the water is at the top. And I just want to point out a couple of quick things. He told me about watching the Chinese workers who lived in the China House at PAF walk across to their garden and pigsty. And he put it here. Now here's Harris Avenue, and here's 4th, and here's where now the sewage treatment plant is. Well, I went to Gordy Twait's museum and got this fun picture. Here's the Chinese garden. And here's the pig house where they raise pigs. Here, by the way, is the Larrabee home, now Laremont Manor, at the top of the hill. And Joe Hansen talked about ice skating in the marsh behind the railroad track. And well, now what's happened is this has all been scaled down and pushed into the marsh, and the sewage treatment plant sits there. At any rate, those are just fun things. Who would have ever thought there was a pig house there? Well, and here's a minor little thing, but the Sanborn maps are over along the window. They're wonderful insurance maps, and you can learn so much from them. This is the China House. It was built over water, just connected to PAF, and I thought this was kind of fun. Did you know that there were Japanese workers? Jap mess room, Japanese bunks, and look, rice kettles. But what I really got a chuckle out of was, how would you imagine the sanitary system worked? Water closet on the dock over the water, and a larger one. This was probably for the Chinese, and this was probably for the Japanese. Well, curious minds. I'm out of time. So it's time for questions and answers. I have a lot more to tell you, but you're going to have to ask a question. Any? Beware, I'll keep going.
I have a comment.
What's the comment, David?
You dig yourself a lot of holes and you crawl out of them and do a good job.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you another quick story. Laura.
I was wondering if you could talk about Geraldine Donovan.
Okay, all right, I'll get to that. This picture, how many of you have ever driven out by the mouth of the Nooksack and seen all those pilings out there? Do you know what they were? I was always told it was a fish trap. Back in the days, that made all kinds of sense. I thought it was a fish trap. Well, it wasn't a fish trap. The Bellingham Bay Boom Company built that in 1890. The course of the Nooksack River had just been changed from Lummi Bay into Bellingham Bay, and now the loggers were dumping logs in the Nooksack River, and they were floating down the river where they could be picked up and easily taken to the sawmills. And the Bellingham Bay Boom Company was formed by a bunch of Fairhaven guys, actually, to build a trap to catch the logs at the mouth of the river. And I learned about that and thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Then I looked on the old wonderful 1891 Fairhaven Bird's Eye, and look here. Geez, they depict it perfectly. There's the log trap. And then I learned that the little steamboats used to go up the river to supply Linden and Ferndale. And the steamboats, even though they had apparently some sort of a device to allow steamboats in here, you had to open a gate and it was very difficult. So the steamers didn't like it and they sued the Bellingham Bay Boom Company, and it went all through the Washington state courts, and it ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, where in 1894, the Supreme Court said, you got to take it out. They supported the rights of navigation, and it's still a bedrock case for the rights of navigation. So, but the incredible thing is that those piling are still there. They look just like that. 1890 they were put in. Well, anyway. But history stories have a way of continuing and not ever ending. I've written about, I didn't mean to show that. Well, just the other day, a fellow brought me this map. This is an 1894 Corps of Engineers map that shows the piling, the log trap here too. Just 10 days ago, Laura Lofrado called me and said, let's have a cup of coffee. I've got some questions. And she surprised me. Laura, if you don't know, is an English teacher at the university, and she recently wrote the biography of Ella Higginson. And she's deeply into Ella Higginson, and she collects Ella Higginson's stuff. So we met at a coffee shop, and she gifted me this, and I was quite thrilled. I hadn't been following Ella Higginson, but it was a nice gift. I was quite thrilled because when I opened it, it says, "To dearest Geraldine, with love, Jack." October 1943. And when you thumb through the pages, there are all kinds of little notations written by Geraldine Goodhart Donovan. Geraldine was Jack Donovan's daughter. And Laura didn't know this, but she was puzzled by the strange, they're writing all over the place, and it doesn't all make sense. And some of it is kind of weird. And I said, of course. It was dated 1943, and poor Geraldine was insane. So there's another fascinating history story. And for you, Laura, I'm going to read something. When Gail and I were reading letters, I was taking notes from all the letters and the stuff that was in the treasures of the trunk. And this is kind of the lifeline of J.J. Donovan. And I found and I copied this letter. Clara writes to Mrs. Thurston, January 19th, 1936. The family is a good deal upset just now. This time it is poor Geraldine. This is the story. About 10 days ago, when Jack was going to Seattle and Portland on business, he took Geraldine along for a few days' visit with good friends in Tacoma. On his return, he didn't bring her home, as he thought it would be all right to visit for a few days as she so desired. She to return in a few days. When her hostess took her to the train, Geraldine informed her that she was not going to Bellingham, but to Boston, and nothing could prevent her from taking the Great Northern train to Chicago. Last night or this morning, a wire came. She had had a bad attack on the train and had been removed to the hospital in Rochester. I suppose Jack will have to go after her, starting tomorrow, probably. It may be the best, as we have known for a long time, that she should be committed to a psychiatric hospital, but poor Jack thought it seemed cruel. Well, at any rate, it's a tragic story that ended up with her being taken to Seattle and given a lobotomy. And she lived in their lovely house at 15th and Garden until she was 81 when she died, until 1973. Alone. They divorced, Jack remarried, but Gordy Twait told me Jack came up frequently to look after her. And this book was given to her after the lobotomy. So, you know, there are 1,000 stories, and that's what historians love to dig up. Thank you. We have time for some questions.
What is the name of the case, 1894 case, that one before Scott?
I have it, but I didn't write it down. Bellingham Boom, if you can Google it and find Bellingham Boom Company. Yeah.
1894?
Yeah, 1894. You bet. Yes.
So you shared some really good answers that you got to, and I was wondering what mysteries you're still sort of trying to track down.
Oh, I've got one for you. I've got one for you. It's right up there. Look out the window at that huge elm tree. It's kind of blocked by a smaller tree, but behind that tree is a massive American elm. It's got to be hundreds of years, well, not hundreds, but 100 years old. All of this land, from Douglas on up, 331 acres, was homesteaded by the Lyle family in 1853. And Mr. Lyle, John Lyle, I believe his name was, lived with Alonzo Poe. The family lived with Alonzo Poe while John Lyle hiked up the hill to build his cabin. And they owned the valley and both the hills. So they owned all of this. They owned half of what would now be the university. And nobody knows where their house was, where that cabin was that they built, or that house. They lived there they raised children there. They lived there for I don't know how many years. And I don't know where it was, and it just bugs me. I'd love to know. But that elm tree had to have been planted by Mrs. Lyle. I can just hear her saying, "John, I want an elm tree like we used to have back home." They came out on a wagon train. And you know, that elm tree is not native to Bellingham, Washington, or the Pacific Northwest. So I just know it was planted by the Lyles beside their house. I don't know that. Maybe we'll find out one day. You dig. Good. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Hi, Bob.
Most of the documentation that you're citing and using is on paper. What's the effect going to be that much now is electronic? How's that going to affect historical research and historical knowledge?
Boy, I don't know. You know, electronics have made it so much easier. So much of what we have learned has come electronically. So that's been a blessing. But what maybe your question directs us to is cursive writing. I urge you to come up and look at the handwriting of J.J. Donovan in these letters. Gil and I read 2,020 letters, and every one of them was legible. They weren't all his. They were from friends and people. People learned to write back then. Now I'm told that cursive writing is no longer taught in schools. So if you're going to be a history major, if you're a kindergartner today and you end up wanting to be a history major, you're going to have to go to college to learn cursive writing. But I can tell you that I think it's a mixed bag, Bob. Electronics have helped immensely in finding things, but much of what you find is paper from which you have to be able to read. But I suspect history will keep going. We'll keep at it. Well, we were going to meet until I was a little confused by the timing, but we're doing all right. I have a story or two more to tell you, maybe if I can find it. Well, the doctor, the director of the libraries mentioned My Darling Anna, the book. My Darling Anna was a story of a doctor who came from Iowa to Fairhaven at the height of the boom and wrote a letter back to his fiancée every day, and every letter started My Darling Anna. But the result of that romance and that story was their one child, Margaret Gray. Margaret Gray was a legendary teacher in the Bellingham School District, starting in the Fairhaven School and retiring finally from Bellingham High School in 1957. She was my English teacher. She was the drama teacher. I think she taught me the love of language. She made us stand in front of the class and read Shakespeare. And that was a terrifying thing to do. But she taught me to speak. I think she taught me to enunciate. She was terrific. So that book, in great measure, was testimony to her. She was kind of stuck in the past. She kept all of her family's things. She never married. And one day I was doing an oral history with with Margaret Morse Watts, who was the daughter of Cecil Morse, the son of Morse Hardware's leader, beginner. And her son came along as we were doing the oral history, and at the end of it, when I was done, he said, "You know, Miss Gray gave my mother," who was a dear friend of my mother's, and before she died, she gave my mother some furniture. Would you like to see it? Well, sure, I'd like to see it. And there it is. So I saw this, and we pulled out a drawer, and underneath the drawer is the name, Dr. Gray. And so we know that's the thing. But the kick for me was, in My Darling Anna, we have a photograph of Anna's bedroom back in Iowa, and that is in the photograph, and I recognized it. I thought, geez, I've seen that. Isn't that fun? So anyway, well, you know, it doesn't take a lot to get a historian excited. Well, I guess two more quickies. Dumb luck has a whole lot to do with research. One day I got a phone call from Joel Douglas, who said, "Hey, he's the owner of Lermont Manor. How would you like the Fairhaven Water Company records?" I went over and he gave me a cardboard box full of the records of the Fairhaven Water Company, dating back to 1880, when Fairhaven began, and they put a water system into Lake Padden to bring water to Fairhaven. And here were all the records. He had been drinking beer at the Culshan Tavern in the Waldron building one time years ago, and the barkeep says, "Hey, you just bought Laremont Manor. I bet you'd like these old papers." And we got them upstairs. So they went upstairs, and here were all the water company papers. Well, it's pretty fascinating reading. And there, all that stuff ends up being here, by the way. And then just a month ago, a relative of Frank I. Seifert, the old editor of the Bellingham Herald, said to me, and the guy, by the way, who apparently got the president of the university fired, so he's a controversial and interesting guy. He says, "You know, we've got a whole bunch of wire recordings from Frank Seifert, my great-great-grandfather. You want them?" Well, sure, I want them. So we're going to, and he even has a machine that'll play them. Who knows what Frank I. Seifert was saying, but boy, that's kind of exciting. Or, well, sometimes the excitement flops. During the Donovan exhibition, a man came up to me one Saturday. I was down there and doing a lecture, and he said to me, "I'm a relative of Nelson Bennett." Nelson Bennett was the man who bought Fairhaven from Dirty Dan Harris. Nelson Bennett was really the power and the money and the vision behind developing Fairhaven, period, in 1880. Wow. He says, "I've got the autobiography of Nelson Bennett. He wrote it. Would you like it?" Oh, I almost fainted. Well, after a few weeks, I said, "Please copy it. I'll pay for the copy and send it to me." I got it in the mail. It's a magnificent, fascinating autobiography, and it stops in 1879, before he came to Fairhaven. So it's a great story of the war of the Indian Wars and all kinds of stuff, but oh, what a disappointment. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you for coming.